Good morning again, Coffee Chat friend. Back here to have another little coffee chat in my own head and share this with you as well on some important, what I feel are important ideas on improving the quality of our life experience. Different topic each day, but once again along the same line of finding out what is truthful. This morning I wanted to talk a little bit about principle. Principle, I think, is a very important thing because, speaking for myself, my own perspective once again, I have lived an unprincipled life for many years, and from what I can see, that has caused me a lot of grief and has left me with a lot of room for improvement. Well, I want to just have a quick look at the definition of principle first of all, and just speak to that definition, both the current definitions, some of them anyway, and the origin of the word. The origin of the word principle is related to words like source, foundation, precept, first, and chief. Well, that's really talks a lot about origins, doesn't it? So when we want to talk about principles, we're talking about what comes first in a train of ideas or procedures and these sorts of things. So, and I'd like to use the example of building a house, probably because I've done a lot of handyman work and swinging hammers and whatnot. There's an old saying, and it makes a lot of sense really. If you don't get your foundation right, if you don't get your foundation level, if you don't get your foundation square, the rest of the house is going to be a matter of trying to correct. But it's always going to be in reference to that foundation. If the foundation is right, the rest of it can be right. If the foundation is not right, then we have to compensate for what was not right. So, having principles is like having a foundation. And if the principles are solid and true, accurate, these sorts of things, then we can have a more solid, true, and accurate afterward, if you will. The basic everyday definition, which I just looked up in the dictionary: principle, fundamental truth or proposition that serves as a foundation for a system of belief or a chain of reasoning. That was the first definition I got from my dictionary. The second one was morally correct behavior. Now, one thing about principles is that when we have morally correct behavior, and we'll talk more about morals later. I mean, I'm not trying to say that any one moral is better than another. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about just having them, having principles. It serves as a foundation. So, going back to the first one, fundamental truth or proposition that serves as a foundation for a system of belief or chain of reasoning. Now, belief, I would say, in its normal usage, or very often used anyways, although at least the way people say it and the way I have said it, is not based on it's not necessarily based on a lot of principle. It's not based on necessarily fundamental truths. It might be based on a feeling, or something I've seen, or something said, or something that was on the news. It's not necessarily based on something strong. It's based on what was based on what was based on what was based on. But if it's based on a fundamental truth or proposition that serves as a foundation, then if that is always the case, if beliefs are always that, then beliefs are always going to go in a certain way. They're always going to be based on the same baseline, right? There's once again, coming back to building a house, right? If there's several floors and different walls and what have you, if you have a reference point from which periodically you go back and make a measurement to, the house is always going to be perfectly true, straight, even, the way you want it. However, if you measure off the foundation and then build something, and the next time you build something, you measure from what you last built. And then the next time you build from what you last built, and so on. Then eventually, as errors creep in, they're going to multiply. It's like if you're measuring off where to put the studs. If you measure from the end, and then go to here, and go to here, and go to here, and go to here, always from in reference to the end, then you're going to have accuracy. But if you were to measure 16 inches, and then move and measure from that 16 inches, and that 16 inches, and that 16 inches, and that 16 inches, and so on, you'd have the creep of error that can come in. And this is what so often happens with what we talked about yesterday, the history of propaganda and so on. If we're going by what somebody else says, that's not going back to a reference point. Another reference point example would be surveyors. My brother's a surveyor, for example, and surveyors are people who, basically draw lines on the land. Say, okay, the boundary is here. And it has to be very accurate, because otherwise there's big disputes come up. So what do they use? They use reference points. They use foundational reference points. They use like a principle, a source point. It might be in an area of many acres. They might only have one source point, and then maybe another reference point in terms of an angle or something like this. I'm not exactly sure how it works. But they're not just measuring this block and then going over to this block and measuring it from this block and so on and so on. They're always referencing it back. That's why you'll see when there's a survey crew out, there's somebody standing way down the road with a tripod thingy and he's sighting and so on. Because he's taking a reference point from the source. It's like a principled source. And you're going forward from there. Well, how does this work in discussions, for example, or in discourse within our own consciousness when we get confused? Well, if we have fundamental truths buried deep within us, we can reference what we're trying to learn, where we're going, what we're building, what other people are saying, and whatnot to that. And be able to discern whether it's truthful or not for us. As an example, a few weeks ago, I was in southern Ontario and I was visiting a friend of mine. And the discussion, I'm not sure how it started, he just presumed that I believed a certain way or whatever. And so the discussion began into the whole government thing, right? The government, the legitimacy of government. And of course, understandably, an argument that's often made, or an assertion that's often made, it's not even an argument really, is that we need government because otherwise there would be chaos, or something to that effect. And then when I question that sort of assertion, the question comes back often from discussions like this, well, what's your solution to this? And my comment at this point, and it was then, that I don't have a solution. And it doesn't matter, because I've got a principled or a moral stand on it, which cannot fall. And my principled or moral stand is that if somebody has not agreed to be governed by a whole bunch of rules and regulations, they have not agreed to it, then they can't possibly be held to that. And if they are, then in fact what's going on is slavery. The slavery is basically, you say to somebody, come up to somebody and say, you have to do this, and if you don't, I'm going to punish you. Right? When people own slaves, the slave didn't matter what the slave thought. It was, I'm your authority, and I'm just telling you that you have to do this and that and this and that. And if you don't, I'm going to whip you, or something like that. Well, the relationship, in a coercive relationship like government with citizens, say, is exactly the same, except it just appears to be different. But in principle, once again, going back to the fundamentals of what's going on, the fundamental of what's going on is that there's some people telling other people how to behave. And some of those people who are being told have not overtly agreed to it. And if they don't, but still, even if they haven't agreed to it, if they don't do it, they're punished. Well, that, if you really look at it in terms of definition, clear definition or clear analysis, is a form of slavery. And my answer was, well, I don't have an answer to how it's going to work or how it could be done. But it doesn't matter, because I have a principle that any coercive relationship between a group of human beings, another group of human beings, one human being, another group of human beings, a million human beings and one human being, it doesn't matter. If the human being who's being forced around at a gunpoint, or threats and intimidation, being thrown in a cage, or fines and what have you, has not overtly agreed to be governed, then the principle says that that's wrong. So that's how we don't have to argue anymore when we stand in principle. Stand with foundation of what is right for us. And it's something that's deep within us when we begin to analyze these things. Often, a lot of times, principles have to do with what is right for me and what is wrong for me. It's like a black and white. It's like a principle would be that it is wrong for me to murder somebody. Right? And that's what I mean often. Principles and morals are actually very similar in this case. It's morally wrong. Why is it morally wrong? Well, I feel that I wouldn't want to be killed for no reason. Just somebody come along and kill me. If I feel I don't want that to happen to me, then I don't want to do it to others. If I don't want to be bossed around just for no reason because I haven't agreed to, well, I don't want to do that to anybody else. And why is it right for anybody else to do it? So it's a principle issue. I know this has gotten off track a little bit, but so coming back to how do principles improve the quality of our life experience? Well, in a way, it systematizes it. In fact, it's even in here. It says here in this definition, the fundamental truth or proposition that serves as a foundation for a system of belief or a chain of reasoning. So when there's a chain of reasoning, and it's interesting, isn't it? I like that term, chain of reasoning, because reasoning is, you move on to the next point of reasoning, but based on the link from the last one. But then it's all referenced back to the source. Where did this reasoning begin? So it has to begin with truth. And from that truth is step out into the chain of reasoning. And that is systematic, isn't it? It's not just, I'm going to go over here because I feel that this is correct. Well, feeling that it's correct might be valuable, but is there a reasoned, is there a chain of reasoning that leads back to it? And if there's not a chain of reasoning that leads back to it, it's not based on principles. This is based on emotion, for example, or it's based on faith alone, blind faith, or it's based on belief. But if belief has this chain of reasoning to it, then it is a valid belief. It may not be 100% true. There could be errors in the belief, but that's why we keep referencing back. It doesn't have to reference back every moment. Like in building the house, when I've built things before, I don't necessarily measure back to the source point every time I make a measurement. But whenever there's doubt that comes in, and I remember doing it many times, I have a reference point at the bottom of the foundation. Whether that's level, whether that's plumb, whether that's distance, if I can get a measurement back there, and there's an error there, now I can cheat it back to where it should be. Or if I've made a huge error, I got to take something down and start again. Don't have to measure every time. So reasoning can be linked back to the previous step. But when there becomes the diversion of error, then going back to that source of that principle. Remember when I was talking to this guy, I got a little bit flustered at one point because he was questioning me. This often happens when we have a stance or a way of living that is very different from other people. I mean, when you step out of the norm, people question you, and it'll make... I remember when I first became a vegetarian, people would ask me the weirdest questions. And I don't call myself a vegetarian anymore, even though that's mostly how I behave. People would ask the strangest questions, like they'd ask, like, how do you live on salads? And this sort of thing. And I was puzzled by the questioning, because I don't eat salads for the most part, you know? And they wouldn't understand that at all. Or if I go to somebody's place, they found out that I was a vegetarian, they put a salad in front of me, you know, and I really appreciated the thought. But it's really quite odd how people, they don't understand us. And we can get flustered. There can be the tendency to sometimes get defensive and all these sorts of things. But one of the things that helps with self-knowledge and with confidence and poise and being able to enjoy a conversation without having to get rattled or put the other guy down or anything like that, and just enjoy the human sharing, is to come off from a principled standpoint. And you know what? People respect that. If, like my friend there, when I finally told him, look, I don't have the answers, but it's a moral issue for me. And a lot of times you can turn it back and use a little bit of the Socratic method of questioning to help them see the principle. You know, I said to him, for example, is it right for you to tell me what to do? To just boss me around? No. Is it right for me to just go bossing you around without your permission and threatening you with whatever I feel is important? And he said no. So I said, well, what if 1,000 people came and threatened you into doing this and that and the other thing? No, that still doesn't make any sense. That's what I was getting to, was the principle. And he said, well, why does any organization have an exemption from morality? You know, why does any organization have? But then there's the disconnect, because there's the tendency that we have to flip back into our stupefied state, which is what we talked about yesterday. Switch back in to the program that has been there for 20, 30, 40, 50 years of, this is the way it is, this is our education, this is the glory and guts and glory of all these wars and how we have our freedom because all these guys died. But wait a minute here. What's the principle behind that? What's the foundation behind that? Who's talking about that? Is it a principle that I have systematically set forth in a chain of reasoning? No, it's not usually. It's coming from, it's an emotional jump into an old program. And these things are deep-seated in our subconscious, I would say. A little bit deep perhaps, but I think it's important. I wanted to share it this morning, the importance of principles. I'm not here to try to tell anybody what principle they should or should not abide by. But when we are honest with ourselves, when we're truthful with ourselves, we want peace, happiness, joy, freedom for ourselves, right? And that can form part of principles. We want freedom for ourselves. Based on that principle, we have to want the freedom for others. And we have to want, if we want truth for ourselves, surely we want truth for others. So we no longer support lies. We'll point out the lies. Through ourselves. That's often the best way to do it, isn't it? To admit that we have fallen prey to lies. people understand that better than telling them you are falling prey to lies. Is that true? I think it is, and probably why the old Socratic method of asking questions and listening is so important. Which reminds me, I better get back to some listening pretty soon too. I've been talking quite a bit here. Once again, it was great sharing with you, and I want to do this again more often. If you have any ideas as to what to talk about, chime in on the videos in the comment section. And I know I've been promising it, but pretty soon I'm going to start an online coffee chat, which will allow people to come right in and have a face-to-face like this online. Until that is, I get back to a more populated region. I'm in the mountains right now, become a bit of a mountain man, trying to anyway, for a while. So once again, the importance of principles, I think they are foundational to how we live our lives. Foundation, it's right in the definition. Source. If we're going to live, we got to live by our source, by our foundation, whether we like it or not. So why not get in touch with it and reference back to that source of what creates us, of what builds us, what sustains us, of what is truthful to us as often as we can. Great talking to you. My name is Steve. I'm signing off for now. Talk to you later.